They mocked a disabled veteran in a wheelchair, harassed the staff at a small Montana diner, and thought their drunken intimidation would go unchallenged. But the Red Devils were about to learn the most brutal lesson of their lives. Behind those quiet eyes and gentle demeanor sat a legend, Michael "Iron Will" Anderson, one of America's most decorated Army Rangers whose classified missions had earned him honors too secret to display. For 2 weeks they pushed him, never realizing they were awakening a force that would transform not just their lives, but an entire town. Then came the phone call. Within hours, 30 hardened combat veterans descended on Pine Valley, men and women who had served with Anderson in battles too classified to discuss. But what happened next wasn't the bloodbath everyone expected. Instead, Pine Valley witnessed something far more powerful. A story of honor, redemption, and the kind of strength that turns enemies into protectors. Quick pause. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely incredible. The autumn morning painted Pine Valley, Montana in shades of crimson and gold as Emma's family diner came to life. Steam rose from fresh coffee and sizzling bacon, mixing with the crisp mountain air and scent of fallen leaves. Inside, Lisa Chen arranged silverware with practiced precision, her movements reflecting 5 years of morning rituals in this small-town sanctuary. The bell above Emma's door chimed precisely at 7:15 a.m. as Michael Anderson wheeled himself through the entrance, his movements measured and deliberate despite his disability. Lisa approached with a warm smile, already moving to guide him to his regular corner table near the window. "Morning, Mr. Anderson," she said cheerfully. "Coffee's fresh, and Emma made those cranberry scones you like." Michael's weathered face creased with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Lisa. How's Tommy doing with his college applications?" The diner slowly filled with its morning regulars. Tom Parker from the hardware store nodded respectfully as he passed. Mrs. Eleanor Wright arranged fresh flowers in her usual spot, her garden shop across the street already displaying its morning blooms. Each person carried their own story, their own connection to this quiet corner of Montana. Emma Martinez emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd owned this diner for 18 years, serving meals and memories to generations of Pine Valley residents. Her eyes softened at the sight of Michael, remembering the day 2 years ago when he'd first wheeled through her door. "The usual Michael," she called out, already reaching for his favorite mug. "Please, Emma, maybe an extra side of hash browns today." His voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made people listen without knowing exactly why. Outside, the morning traffic moved unhurriedly past the diner's windows. Deputy Sarah Collins parked her cruiser across the street, her young face serious as she scanned the area. Something had the local law enforcement on edge lately. Lisa refilled Michael's coffee, noting how his head tilted slightly at the sound of motorcycles in the distance. Most people wouldn't have caught it, but she'd served him long enough to notice these small details. "Quite a few new faces in town lately," she mentioned casually, watching his response. Michael's fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup, a habit she'd noticed whenever he was processing information. "Yes, the wind brings change sometimes, Lisa. Not all of it welcome." The rumble of motorcycles grew louder, then faded as they passed the outskirts of town. Sheriff Jack Matthews's patrol car rolled past the diner slowly, his experienced eyes surveying the street. The peace of Pine Valley felt somehow fragile this morning, like the calm before a storm. Mrs. Wright approached Michael's table, her usual morning ritual. "These are for you, Michael," she said, placing a small vase of fresh wildflowers on his table. "Mountain lilies today. They remind me of strength." Michael reached out, his fingers gently touching the petals. "Thank you, Eleanor. They smell like courage." The diner conversation ebbed and flowed around them. Regular customers discussed local news, shared stories, and exchanged greetings. But beneath this normal morning rhythm ran an undercurrent of tension, subtle but present. Emma returned to Michael's table with his breakfast. "Town council's meeting tonight," she mentioned, setting down his plate. "Sheriff Matthews has requested extra time to discuss community safety." Michael nodded thoughtfully, his eyes somehow seeing more than most. "Interesting times we're living in, Emma." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the diner windows. Lisa watched Michael eat his breakfast with military precision, each movement economical and practiced. Sometimes she caught glimpses of who he must have been before the wheelchair. Those moments reminded her that still waters often ran deeper than anyone suspected. Deputy Collins entered the diner, the bell announcing her arrival. She approached. The counter, her voice low as she spoke to Emma, something about suspicious activity at the old mill property, bikers gathering there at night. Michael's head tilted again, catching fragments of their conversation. His hands remained steady, on his coffee cup, but Lisa noticed the slight straightening of his spine, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture. "More coffee, Mr. Anderson?" she asked, already knowing his answer. "Not today, Lisa. I think I'll head home early." His voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. "Something tells me we should all keep our eyes open today." As Michael wheeled himself toward the door, the morning sun caught his resolute expression, concealing eyes that had once watched over America's most dangerous battlefields. Behind him, the diner continued its morning routine, unaware that their peaceful world was about to change forever. The rumble of motorcycles echoed again in the distance, closer now. Thunder on the horizon, bringing with it a storm that would test not just Michael Anderson, but the very soul of Pine Valley itself. The morning sun struggled through heavy clouds as 5 motorcycles roared into Pine Valley's main street, their chrome-laden Harley-Davidsons cutting through the quiet mountain air. The Red Devils Motorcycle Club had been making their presence known across 3 states, their reputation for chaos preceding them like a dark wind. Leading the formation was Victor the Viper Kane, his massive black motorcycle thundering past. Emma's diner as breakfast regulars peered nervously through the windows. Behind him rode his inner circle, Marcus Rage Reynolds, with his distinctive flame-painted helmet, Steve Snake Thompson scanning the streets with predatory focus, Luke Ghost Wilson's silver bike reflecting the dim light, and Derek Demon Miller taking mental notes of every business they passed. Inside Emma's diner, Lisa Chen's hand trembled slightly as she poured coffee, her eyes meeting Emma's across the counter. Michael Anderson sat at his usual corner table, his posture unchanged, but his head tilted in that subtle way that told Lisa he was mapping every sound, every movement. The bell above the door chimed as Kane and his inner circle entered, leather cuts creaking, boots heavy on the worn linoleum. The morning crowd fell silent, some customers instinctively drawing back into their booths, trying to make themselves invisible. The smell of leather and motor oil mixed with the diner's usual breakfast aromas, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. "Well, well," Kane's voice carried across the diner, deep and theatrical. "Quaint little place you've got here." Emma stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. "Welcome to Emma's. Coffee's fresh if you're interested." Kane ignored her, his attention drawn to Michael's corner. He nudged Reynolds, nodding, toward the disabled veteran. "Check out the hero in the corner. Guess they let anyone in here these days." Michael continued eating his breakfast, his movements deliberate and controlled, years of military discipline evident in every motion, though few would recognize it for what it was. "Sir?" Lisa approached Kane's group, professional despite her. "Unease. There's a larger table available if you'd like to be seated." "Boys," Kane called to his men, ignoring Lisa. "Let's get a closer look at our disabled friend here." They moved toward Michael's table, their reflections growing larger in the diner's windows. The other customers watched in horrified silence, memories of news reports about Red Devil's activities in other towns fresh in their minds. "Nice setup you got here, old-timer." Reynolds leaned over the table, alcohol evident on his breath despite the early hour. "Government takes good care of their broken toys, don't they?" Michael set down his fork with military precision. "They do what they can." His voice carried no fear, no anger, just calm certainty that made Kane's eyes narrow slightly. Outside, Sheriff Matthews's patrol car rolled past the diner, slowing as he noted the collection of motorcycles. He spoke quietly into his radio, his experienced eyes taking in the scene through the windows. "You know what I think?" Kane pulled out a chair, spinning it around to sit backwards at Michael's table. "I think a man like you needs to learn his place in the new order. Pine Valley's changing, Pops. Best learn that quick." Michael's hands remained steady on the table, his breath even. "Every man learns what he's capable of learning, Mr. Kane. Some lessons are harder than others." Kane's face darkened at the use of his name. "You know who I am? Your reputation precedes you," Michael replied calmly.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Though reputations aren't always accurate measures of a man's worth. Emma moved closer to the table, coffee pot in hand. Her grip was white-knuckled, the pot ready to become a weapon if needed. But Michael's slight headshake stopped her. A gesture so subtle, only someone watching for it would notice. "Boss," Miller called from near the window, "we've got company." Sheriff Matthews entered the diner, his steps measured, one hand resting casually near his holster. "Gentlemen, quite a collection of bikes you've got out there. Hope you're not planning an extended stay in Pine Valley." Kane stood slowly, his leather cut creaking. "Just passing through, Sheriff, getting to know the locals." His gaze lingered on Michael, some more interesting than others. "Then I suggest you pass through quickly." Matthew's voice carried the weight of authority backed by law. "Pine Valley's a peaceful town. We'd like to keep it that way." The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Then Kane laughed, the sound lacking any real humor. "Of course, Sheriff, we respect the law." He turned to his men. "Come on, boys. Plenty of time to get acquainted with our new friends." As the Red Devils filed out, Kane paused at Michael's table. "We'll talk again soon, old-timer. Count on it." The bell chimed as they left, the sound of motorcycles growing louder, then fading as they rode away. The diner remained silent for several long moments, the morning peace shattered like fine china. "Michael," Emma approached, her voice shaking slightly. "Are you all right?" "Fine, Emma." He reached for his coffee cup, his movements still perfectly controlled, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the slightly firmer set of his jaw. "Though I believe Pine Valley's about to experience some interesting times." Sheriff Matthews watched the motorcycles disappear down Main Street, his face grim. "Michael, a word when you have a moment." Outside, clouds continued to gather, darker now. The thunder that rolled across Pine Valley was real this time, nature's own warning of the storm to come. But in Emma's diner, as Lisa watched Michael's calm demeanor and steady hands, she couldn't help but wonder if the Red Devils had just made their first serious mistake. Through the windows, more motorcycles appeared on the horizon, their engines growing louder as they approached town. The Red Devils weren't just passing through, they were bringing reinforcements. Pine Valley's peaceful existence was about to be tested in ways no one could have imagined, except perhaps for the quiet veteran who sat calmly finishing his coffee, his military training already assessing and planning for what was to come. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform not just a small Montana town, but the very nature of strength and redemption. The Red Devils were about to learn that true power didn't always come from intimidation, and that sometimes the most formidable warriors were the ones who appeared the most vulnerable. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Valleys. Main Street, as Sheriff Matthews's patrol car wound its way up the Pine Line Drive to Michael Anderson's craftsman home. The old house stood like a sentinel on the hillside, its wide porch overlooking the town below. Michael sat in his wheelchair on that porch, facing the approaching vehicle, as if he could anticipate its arrival. "Your cruiser needs an oil change," Michael remarked as Matthews climbed the worn steps. "The engine's running rough." The sheriff settled into a nearby rocking chair, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. "Those weren't ordinary bikers this morning, Michael. My contacts at state police say the Red Devils have taken over 3 towns in the last 4 months. Protection rackets, intimidation, assault. They're professionals at causing trouble." Michael's fingers traced the arm of his wheelchair, the movement deliberate. "And you're worried about how a disabled veteran might handle their attention." "I'm worried about what happens when they push too far." Matthews leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Your military record may be classified, Michael, but I've got friends in high places. I know enough to know you're not as helpless as you appear." The wind stirred fallen leaves across the porch as Michael considered his response. "Everyone in Pine Valley is helpless if we don't stand together, Jack. That's what they don't understand yet." Downtown, the Red Devils were already making their presence known. Reynolds and Thompson walked into Mrs. Wright's flower shop, their leather cuts and heavy boots incongruous among the delicate blooms. "Nice place you got here," Reynolds commented, deliberately knocking over a vase. "Shame if anything happened to it." At the VA clinic, Dr. Rebecca Chen reviewed Michael's file, her concern evident as she spoke on the phone. "Yes, I understand the confidentiality issues, but if the Red Devils are targeting him, I know his history. I treated him after Mosul." Michael's home phone rang, the specialized system announcing Rachel Anderson before he answered. "Dad," his daughter's voice carried worry across the miles, "I just heard about the bikers. Maybe you should come stay with me in Seattle for a while." "This is my home, sweetheart," Michael replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Running isn't the answer." At the town hall, Deputy Collins burst into Matthews's office, clutching a stack of papers. "Sheriff, you need to see this. State police reports on the Red Devils. They're not just another biker gang. They've got military-grade weapons, organized structure. Kane was Special Forces himself before he was discharged, dishonorably." Evening settled over Pine Valley like a heavy blanket. Emma wiped down the diner counters after closing, the routine familiar but somehow ominous in the empty restaurant. The bell chimed, making her freeze. "We're closed," she called out, turning to find Wilson and Miller standing in her diner. "Just wanting to discuss business opportunities." Wilson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Protection services, you might say. These days, small businesses need all the help they can get." Across town, Michael sat in his darkened living room, phone in hand. The number he contemplated calling hadn't been used in years. Behind him, displayed in a shadow box he never saw but always knew was there, hung medals that told only part of his story. Matthew's patrol car rolled past the diner just as the bikers were leaving. Emma's hands shook as she locked up, her mind made up. Tomorrow she'd tell Michael everything. But Michael already knew. He'd heard the entire exchange. Through the phone line, he'd never hung up after their earlier call. In the Red Devils' temporary camp at the old lumber mill, Kane studied photos of Pine Valley's businesses, marking potential targets. But his focus kept returning to the image of Michael Anderson. Something about the disabled veteran nagged at his instincts, like a warning he couldn't quite hear. Dr. Chen worked late at the VA clinic, pulling more files, making more calls. Her computer screen displayed a heavily redacted mission report from Mosul. Only one line was fully visible. Captain Anderson's actions during the incident remained classified at the highest levels. The night deepened over Pine Valley as storm clouds gathered again. In his home, Michael moved through familiar rooms with perfect precision, his fingers brushing past old photographs he could no longer see but had memorized long ago. One frame contained a number and a promise made years ago in places few would understand. Tomorrow would bring choices. Tomorrow would force hands and reveal truths. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of his home, Michael Anderson prepared himself for what he knew was coming, not with weapons or plans of violence, but with the steady resolve that had once made him a legend in places whose names he could never speak. Through the town's empty streets, more motorcycles arrived, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. The Red Devils were establishing their presence, marking their territory. But they had yet to realize that Pine Valley was already under protection, not from weapons or threats, but from something far more powerful. The quiet strength of a warrior who had learned that the greatest battles weren't won through force. Lisa Chen made her way home from the diner, her steps quickening at the sound of motorcycles in the distance. She paused outside the VA clinic, seeing Dr. Chen still at work inside. Through the window, she could make out scattered files and what looked like military photographs. One caught her eye, a younger Michael Anderson in full combat gear, surrounded by other rangers, their faces obscured in the grainy image. The thunder rolled closer as Deputy Collins made her final patrol of the night. She noticed lights on. At the lumber mill, the sound of motorcycles coming and going. Through her cruiser's window, she could see more Red Devils arriving, their numbers growing. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more threats, more choices for everyone in Pine Valley. But in the darkness of his home, Michael Anderson sat calmly, his phone now holding a number he hadn't dialed in years. The time wasn't right, not yet. First, the Red Devils needed to show their true nature. First, Pine Valley needed to understand what kind of strength really mattered. The storm was building, both in the clouds above and in the hearts of those below. Pine Valley stood on the brink of something that would change it forever, and at the center of it all sat a disabled veteran who saw more clearly than anyone what was truly at stake. The morning fog clung to Pine Valley's streets as Michael Anderson's wheelchair cut through the mist, his path to Emma's diner as straight as ever. The Red Devils had spent 3 days establishing their presence in town, their intimidation growing bolder with each passing hour. Today would be different. Michael had sensed it in the air, in the subtle changes of sound around him, in the way vehicles slowed as they passed. Kane sat on his motorcycle across the street, watching the disabled veterans approach. 3 days of digging had yielded nothing but questions. No social media presence, no easily accessible military records. Just whispered rumors and dead ends. Right on schedule, Kane muttered to Reynolds beside him. Like clockwork, man's got military discipline written all over him. Inside the diner, Lisa's hands shook slightly as she arranged Michael's silverware. The bell chimed as he entered, but the usual morning greeting died in her throat as 8 Red Devils followed immediately behind him, more than ever before. Quite an escort you've got today, Emma called from behind the counter, her voice steady despite her fear. Michael wheeled to his usual corner table, his movements unchanged by the biker's presence. Kane pulled up a chair backwards at Michael's table, his leather cut creaking. Been doing some asking around about you, old-timer. Interesting things people don't say when your name comes up, like they're afraid to talk about certain topics. Most people talk too much anyway, Michael replied, his hands finding his coffee cup with practiced ease. Present company included. The door chimed again as Dr. Chen entered, her white coat pristine in the dim diner light. She faltered for just a moment at the scene before her, then moved purposefully toward Michael's table. Kane's hand shot out, blocking her path. "Doctors making house calls now?" Kane sneered, reading her name tag. "How touching." "VA business," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "Protected by federal law. I suggest you move your hand." Outside, a sleek, black SUV parked across the street, its windows tinted. Inside, James Peterson watched the scene unfold through high-powered optics, his scarred hands steady on the binoculars. His phone lay ready beside him, a number already dialed but not yet called. "Dad!" Rachel Anderson's voice cut through the tension as she appeared in the doorway. Her Seattle law firm's briefcase clutched tightly. She hadn't told Michael she was coming, hadn't wanted him to talk her out of it. Kane's eyes shifted between Michael and Rachel, a predatory smile spreading across his face. Well, well, family reunion. Boys, make sure our guests are comfortable. Thompson and Wilson moved to flank the door. Miller positioned himself near the counter, while Snake Thompson lingered near the kitchen entrance. The tactical positioning wasn't lost on Michael, whose head tilted slightly as he mapped their movements by sound. "Rachel," Michael's voice remained calm, "I believe you're late for an appointment." "Not this time, Dad," she replied, moving toward his table despite Reynolds' attempt to intimidate her with his bulk. "Mom didn't raise a coward, and neither did you." At the sheriff's office, Deputy Collins burst in with a manila envelope. "Sheriff, you need to see this. Just came in from military contacts. Kane's discharge wasn't just dishonorable, it was after an operation in Mosul went bad. Same place Anderson was stationed," Matthews finished, reaching for his keys. "Call Dr. Chen, now." Dr. Chen stood her ground near Michael's table, her medical bag clutched tightly. Inside it, beneath normal medical supplies, lay a file she'd spent all night compiling. A file that explained exactly why targeting Michael Anderson was the biggest mistake the Red Devils could make. "You know what I can't figure out?" Kane leaned closer to Michael, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "How a disabled vet rates a VA doctor making personal house calls. How he affords a craftsman house on a disability pension. How he moves like someone who never forgot his training." The morning sun finally broke through the fog, sending shadows dancing across the diner's worn linoleum. Michael's hands remained steady on his coffee cup, but Rachel noticed the subtle shift in his posture, a change so slight only someone who knew him would recognize it. "Mr. Kane," Michael spoke quietly, "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away. Not because I'm afraid, but because what happens next might remind you of things you'd rather forget. Mosul, for instance." Kane's face went white, then red with fury. "How do you know about—" His hand shot out to grab Michael's collar, but froze mid-motion as the blind veteran's head turned to face him with unsettling precision. "The same way I know Thompson just pulled a knife by the counter. The same way I know Wilson is carrying a gun he's not licensed for. The same way I know you've got 4 more men outside besides the 2 by your bikes." The diner fell completely silent. Even the usual morning traffic outside seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Kane's hand trembled slightly, still frozen in mid-reach. "Dad." Rachel's voice carried a warning. "Your phone's ringing." Indeed, a specialized ringtone emanated from Michael's pocket, a tone he hadn't heard in years. James Peterson's finger hovered over the call button in his SUV, ready to summon forces Kane couldn't imagine. "Last chance," Michael said softly. "Walk away, find another town to terrorize, because if you don't, I'll be forced to make a phone call. And believe me, Mr. Kane, you don't want me to make that call." Sheriff Matthews's cruiser pulled up outside, followed by 2 state police vehicles. Through the windows, they could see Dr. Chen opening her medical bag, pulling out not medical supplies, but a file stamped with classified markings. "You're bluffing!" Kane snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're just a broken-down old man playing at being dangerous." Michael's lips curved in a slight smile. "Then why are you sweating, Mr. Kane? Why did your heart rate spike when I mentioned Mosul? Why are you suddenly remembering whispered warnings about a certain ranger whose missions there will remain classified for 30 more years?" The morning sun broke fully through the clouds, streaming through Emma's diner windows. In that bright light, Kane finally saw what he'd missed before. Behind that calm exterior sat a man who had once been legend in places where legends got you killed. "Boss!" Miller called urgently from the counter. "We got company! Lots of company!" Through the windows, they could see vehicles arriving, not just police, but black SUVs with government plates. Men in suits mixed with others who moved with unmistakable military precision. James Peterson stepped out of his vehicle, his scarred face familiar to Kane from briefings long ago. "Times like these," Michael said quietly, "a man has to decide what kind of future he wants. The kind that comes from pushing people around, or the kind that comes from finding a better way." The Red Devil's leader stood slowly, his leather cut suddenly feeling heavy on his shoulders. In Michael Anderson's calm voice, he heard echoes of firefights and whispered orders, of missions that would never see the light of day. "This isn't over," Kane managed, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Yes, Mr. Kane," Michael replied, "it is. The only question is how it ends. You decide." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Valley's main street as Kane stood in the empty parking lot behind the lumber mill, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. The morning's confrontation at Emma's diner had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The name Anderson had been nagging at his memories since their first encounter, but now the fragments were falling into place. Whispered stories from his own military days, warnings about a legendary ranger whose very existence was classified. Inside the sheriff's office, Dr. Chen spread photographs across Matthews's desk, medical records from Mosul, heavily redacted mission reports, and one clear photograph of a younger Michael Anderson receiving a medal that officially didn't exist. "The mission that cost him his sight," Dr. Chen explained, her voice low, "saved 42 lives, including Kane's unit. He just doesn't remember because of the trauma. Michael was already injured when he carried Kane out of that compound." Back at the diner, Rachel Anderson worked her lawyer's magic, turning Emma's into a temporary command center. Her laptop displayed federal regulations and statutes as she coordinated with state authorities. "The Red Devils have violated multiple federal laws," she explained to Sheriff Matthews, "but Dad doesn't want them destroyed. He wants them rehabilitated." James Peterson's network was already in motion. Veterans from 4 states were quietly converging on Pine Valley, not for violence, but to stand ready if needed. Each one owed Michael Anderson a debt that no amount of time could erase. Reynolds found Kane behind the mill, the gang leader's usual confidence noticeably shaken. "Boss, something's not right. That disabled vet, the way he knew where everyone was standing, how he moved. I've seen that before, in operators who've been through the real stuff." The afternoon light caught the chrome of motorcycles as more Red Devils arrived at their makeshift camp, but there was uncertainty in their movements now, whispered conversations carrying on the wind. The story of the morning's confrontation had spread, growing with each retelling. "Heard he was Force Recon," one biker muttered. "Nah, darker than that," another replied. "Black Ops stuff, the kind of missions that never happened." Emma Martinez stood in her diner's doorway, watching Red Devils ride past with less swagger than before. The morning's events had changed something. When Miller tried to enter for coffee, she met him with steady eyes. "You want coffee?" she asked calmly. "Fine, but in my diner, you're just men. Leave the intimidation outside." To everyone's surprise, Miller removed his cut before entering. The simple act sent ripples through the watching gang members. At the VA clinic, Dr. Chen received calls from military contacts across the country. "It's starting," she told Michael over a secure line. "Kane's record is surfacing. He's not just any dishonorably discharged soldier. He's someone you saved, someone who lost his way." Michael sat in his garden, the afternoon sun warm on his face as Rachel read reports from her legal contacts. "The state's preparing a RICO case," she explained. "But there might be another way, Dad, a way to save them instead of destroying them." Kane paced the mill's empty interior, memories flooding back, flashes of fire and blood, of a voice in the darkness commanding him to live, of hands dragging him to safety. He'd buried those memories under years of anger and violence, but they were surfacing now, demanding to be acknowledged. Thompson approached Kane cautiously. "Boss, we got word from other chapters. They're hearing stories about Anderson. Big stories. The kind that make hard men nervous." In town, the atmosphere had shifted. Where Red Devils had swaggered yesterday, today they moved with uncertainty. Local residents who had hidden in fear now stood their ground, understanding that the tide was turning. James Peterson's SUV cruised past the mill, his scarred face visible to Kane through the fence, a reminder of other soldiers who had lost their way but found redemption. The message was clear. There were second chances for those willing to take them. Michael's phone rang, a secure line from his past. "The dominoes are falling," his old commander reported. "Kane's full record is being unsealed. He needs to know the truth about Mosul, about what you did for his men." Rachel watched her father's face as he absorbed the news. "You're not just going to stop them, are you, Dad? You're going to save them." "Everyone deserves a chance to find their way home," Michael replied softly. "Even those who've forgotten they're lost." At the mill, Kane discovered old newspaper clippings in his personal files, headlines about a classified operation, about a legendary operator who went back into a burning compound again and again until all was saved. The dates matched his nightmares, the ones he drowned in alcohol and violence for years. Emma closed the diner early, but not before witnessing something remarkable. 3 Red Devils had eaten lunch there, peaceful and respectful, their cuts left on their bikes. The change was starting, one small gesture at a time. Sheriff Matthews met with town council members, explaining the shifting situation. "This isn't just about law enforcement anymore," he said. "This is about redemption. Anderson's playing a longer game than any of us realized." As evening approached, Kane found himself driving to the local library, using a computer to search for information he'd been afraid to face. Articles about post-traumatic stress, about veterans losing their way, about programs for rehabilitation. His hands trembled on the keyboard. The sun set over Pine Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Michael sat on his porch, listening to the changing patterns of motorcycle sounds through his town. The rumble of engines carried less menace now, more uncertainty. "They're fracturing," James Peterson reported, joining Michael on the porch. "Some want to double down, go harder. Others are remembering who they were before, thanks to you. The question is, which way will Kane fall?" Rachel brought coffee to the porch, legal papers tucked under her arm. "The federal prosecutors are offering deals to any who want to clean up, get help. Your reputation's opening doors, Dad." Michael smiled slightly, hearing the distant sound of motorcycles heading toward the mill. "Sometimes the strongest men are the ones most lost, Rachel. They build walls of violence and intimidation because they've forgotten how to build bridges of understanding." The night settled over Pine Valley, but change was already in motion. In the mill, Kane stared at his reflection in a broken window, seeing past the hardened gang leader to the soldier he'd once been, the man who'd been saved by another soldier's sacrifice, only to lose himself in the darkness that followed. Tomorrow would bring more chances for both redemption and ruin, but tonight, in the quiet darkness, the first seeds of transformation were taking root in the most unexpected places. in the hearts of men who had forgotten they were once warriors. Of a different kind, the dawn broke over the lumber mill as Kane sat alone in his makeshift office, surrounded by printed articles and military documents. His hands trembled as he read the newly unsealed report from Mosul, the words blurring before his eyes. Unidentified Special Forces operator proceeded to extract all personnel despite sustaining severe injuries. The date matched his nightmares perfectly. Across town, Thompson and two younger Red Devils sat in Emma's diner, their leather cuts conspicuously absent. They watched Michael Anderson at his usual table, gathering courage. Finally, Thompson approached, his usual swagger replaced by something closer to military bearing. "Sir," Thompson spoke quietly, "some of us, we've been talking about getting help, about remembering who we were before all this." In the town hall, voices raised in heated debate. Mayor Harrison stood at the podium, trying to maintain order as citizens argued about the proposed veteran rehabilitation program. Property owners worried about their safety competed with others who saw the chance for real change. "These men are criminals," shouted Tom Parker from the hardware store. "They're lost veterans," Emma countered, standing firmly, "and Michael Anderson's showing them the way back." Rachel Anderson spread documents across the conference room table, surrounded by state officials and Veteran Affairs representatives. "We can create a legal framework," she explained, pointing to successful programs in other states. Rehabilitation instead of incarceration, therapy instead of punishment. Dr. Chen sat with Sheriff Matthews in his office, playing an audio recording from that night in Mosul. The sound of gunfire and explosions filled the small space, then a calm voice cutting through chaos. Michael Anderson, already blinded, guiding men to safety. "Kane was unconscious when Michael carried him out," she explained. "The trauma, the burns. His mind protected itself by forgetting, but somewhere inside, he knows." James Peterson's network grew stronger. Veterans arrived quietly, checking into local motels or staying with supporters. Not for violence, but to show lost warriors a path back to honor. Each one carried their own story of redemption, their own journey back from the edge. At the mill, the tension grew palpable. Reynolds confronted Kane in the main room, his voice carrying to the gathered bikers. "We're losing control. 5 more turned in their cuts this morning. This isn't about territory anymore. Anderson's taking our brothers without firing a shot." Kane stared at the photograph in his hands, a burned and bloody Special Forces operator being loaded onto a helicopter, face unrecognizable except for the eyes. The same eyes he'd seen behind Michael Anderson's calm exterior. "Maybe," Kane replied quietly, "they're not being taken. Maybe they're finding their way home." Emma's diner had become neutral ground. Red Devils sat at tables still wearing their cuts, while others arrived in civilian clothes, choosing to leave their gang identities outside. Emma served them all, watching bridges build over coffee and conversation. Michael sat with Rachel on their porch, listening to her read reports of more gang members seeking help. "You knew this would happen," she said, understanding dawning. "You knew once they remembered who they were, the gang would start to crumble." "Every warrior loses his way sometimes," Michael replied. "The trick isn't forcing them back, it's helping them remember why they chose to serve in the first place." In the VA clinic, Dr. Chen received more calls from military contacts. Records were being unsealed, revealing the full scope of Michael Anderson's service. Each revelation added weight to his quiet authority, making it harder for the Red Devils to maintain their facade of intimidation. Miller found Kane at the mill's fence, staring toward town. "Red Devils are supposed to be about strength," Miller argued. "Anderson's making us look weak." "No!" Kane's voice carried new understanding. "He's showing us what real strength looks like." At the diner, more veterans arrived throughout the day, not obvious or threatening, but their presence was clear to those who knew what to look for. A retired Force Recon Marine drinking coffee at the counter, a former Army Ranger reading the paper by the window. Silent support for Michael's quiet revolution. Rachel worked late into the evening, coordinating with federal agencies. The prosecutors offering immunity, she told her father. Any red devil who voluntarily enters the rehabilitation program gets a clean slate. The night brought more changes. 3 more gang members surrendered their cuts, asking for help. Others hardened their stance, talking about making examples of the traitors. The Red Devils were splitting along lines of redemption and resistance. Kane sat in the darkness of the mill, memories surfacing like bubbles in dark water, the sound of Anderson's voice guiding him to safety, the feeling of being carried through fire, the dead he'd buried under years of violence and rage. "We've got trouble," Reynolds burst in, face flushed with anger. Half the crew's talking about leaving. Anderson's got them thinking they can just walk away, start over. We need to shut this down hard. But Kane barely heard him, lost in the reports spread before him. The details of his rescue, of the man who went back into hell to save others, losing his sight in the process. The same man he'd tried to intimidate, not realizing he owed him everything. Michael's phone rang late, another veteran seeking guidance, another lost warrior looking for the way home. On his porch, he could hear the sound of motorcycles in the distance, but their rhythm was changing. Some rode with the old aggression, but others moved differently now, carrying men who were remembering who they used to be. Tomorrow would bring more choices, more chances for both salvation and destruction. The Red Devils stood at a crossroads, each member facing the hardest battle a warrior can fight, the one within themselves. Oak Harbor held its breath, watching this quiet revolution unfold not with violence or force, but with the steady power of remembrance and redemption. Michael Anderson had started something that couldn't be stopped with threats or intimidation. He'd awakened the warriors sleeping within the warriors, reminding them of oaths taken and honor misplaced. And in the darkness of the mill, Kane stared at his reflection in a broken window, seeing past the hardened gang leader to the soldier he'd once been, the man who'd been saved by another's sacrifice, only to lose himself in the shadows that followed. Tomorrow would force him to choose between the power he'd built and the honor he'd forgotten, between leading men deeper into darkness or helping them find their way back to the light. The war for the soul of the Red Devils had entered its final phase, and its outcome would depend not on strength of arms, but on strength of character. The morning mist clung to Pine Valley's streets as Kane's motorcycle rumbled to a stop outside Emma's diner. For the first time, he'd come alone, his cut unzipped despite the autumn chill. Inside, Michael Anderson sat at his usual corner table, a presence that now seemed to fill the entire room without moving a muscle. Reynolds watched from across the street, fury etched on his face as his leader walked into enemy territory without backup. Behind him, a cluster of hardline Red Devils muttered darkly about weakness and betrayal. They'd spent the night planning retaliation against the traitors who'd turned in their cuts. The diner fell silent as Kane entered, his boots heavy on the worn linoleum. Lisa's hand moved instinctively towards the phone, but Michael's slight headshake stopped her. This moment had been building since the first confrontation, like thunder gathering before a storm. "Your coffee's getting cold," Michael said quietly, as Kane stood by his table, internal warfare visible on the gang leader's face. "You carried me out." Kane's voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "Through the fire in Mosul. I remember now. You were already blind, but you came back for us." Outside, more motorcycles arrived. James Peterson's veterans took up casual positions around the diner, while Red Devils gathered in tight clusters, divided between those watching their leader with concern and others seething with barely contained rage. "Memory's a strange thing," Michael replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Sometimes we bury the hardest ones until we're ready to face them." Reynolds burst through the door, leather cut, creaking with tension. This is how it ends, boss. Sitting down with the enemy, having coffee with the man who's destroying everything we built? Kane turned slowly, years of violence and authority warring with newly awakened memories of honor. The only thing being destroyed is the lie we've been living, Marcus. Look around you. Half our brothers are remembering who they were before they lost their way, like I'm remembering. Dr. Chen arrived quietly, medical bag containing not just supplies, but program documents, contact information for VA support services, paths, back to civilian life. She shared a meaningful look with Emma, who began brewing fresh coffee. They'd planned for this moment. Rachel Anderson's car pulled up outside, followed by Sheriff Matthews's cruiser, not to arrest, but to protect, to witness, to support whatever was about to unfold in this small-town diner that had become ground zero for an unprecedented transformation. "You're weak," Reynolds spat, reaching into his cut. "You're going to throw everything away because of some blind vet who got inside your head? Well, some of us still remember what the Red Devils stand for." The weapon appeared in Reynolds' hand, but before he could raise it, three things happened simultaneously. Kane moved with the speed of his military training. Michael's head turned with preternatural accuracy toward the threat, and James Peterson's veterans smoothly filled the diner's doorway. "What we stand for," Kane's voice carried the weight of recovered memory. "We were soldiers once, protectors. We stood for something real before we lost our way, before we forgot who we were." Through the windows, more Red Devils arrived, but something was different now. Many had removed their cuts, standing apart from the hardliners. Others watched with uncertain expressions, caught between the past they'd built and the future being offered. "It's happening exactly as you said it would," Rachel whispered to her father, watching the scene unfold. "They're choosing sides, but not the way everyone expected." Michael's voice carried clearly through the tense silence. "Every warrior loses his path sometimes. The true test isn't in never falling, but in how we rise again." Reynolds' hand trembled on his weapon. "You're all blind. This isn't about redemption, it's about control. Anderson's taking our brothers without firing a shot, and you're helping him." "No," Kane replied quietly, decades of buried honor surfacing in his voice. "He's reminding us of who we were before the darkness, who we can be again." Outside, more cuts hit the ground as Red Devils made their choices. Emma moved through the diner with coffee, her simple act of serving everyone, equally making a powerful statement about dignity and second chances. "Got room in that program for a few more?" Thompson asked Dr. Chen, his voice carrying clearly through the diner. Others nodded, years of hardened facade cracking to reveal the lost soldiers beneath. Reynolds looked around wildly, seeing our power base eroding. "This isn't over," he snarled, backing toward the door. "You want war? We'll show you war. Anyone who turns in their cut is a dead man." But his threats rang hollow as more Red Devils stepped away from him, moving to stand near Kane or simply leaving their cuts behind as they walked away. The transformation that had started with Michael Anderson's quiet strength was reaching critical mass. "Every man makes his choice," Michael said into the tension. "Every warrior decides what kind of battle he wants to fight. The easy one with fists and threats, or the harder one, the battle to reclaim his honor." Kane sat heavily in the chair across from Michael, the weight of years of violence and misdirected pain visible in his posture. "I don't know how to come back from what I've become," he admitted quietly. "You start by remembering," Michael replied. "Remember the man who took an oath to protect others. Remember the soldier who fought for something bigger than himself. The rest follows naturally." Through the windows, they could see Reynolds and his hardline followers roaring away on their motorcycles, but their departure felt more like a victory than a threat. In their wake, more Red Devils entered the diner, separated from their cuts, ready to talk about finding their way home. Dr. Chen opened her medical bag, spreading hope across the table in the form of programs, contacts, and possibilities. Rachel pulled out legal documents, paths to clean slates for those willing to do the work. James Peterson's veterans shared their own stories of losing and finding their way. The morning sun broke through Pine Valley's mist, illuminating a scene few could have imagined days ago. Former enemies sharing coffee, lost warriors taking their first steps home, and in the center of it all, a blind veteran who saw clearly. What others had forgotten, that underneath the darkness, the light of honor still burned. The war wasn't over. Reynolds and his hardliners would return, desperate to destroy this transformation. But something unstoppable had begun in Emma's diner, something that would ripple out to touch lost warriors far beyond Pine Valley's borders. The real battle was just beginning, not fought with violence, but with the quiet courage of men remembering who they were meant to be. The thunder rolled across Pine Valley as Reynolds paced the floor of an abandoned warehouse 10 miles outside town. Around him, 15 hardline Red Devils seethed with anger and betrayal, their cuts gleaming in the dim light, patches marking them as the ones who'd rejected Kane's transformation, who'd chosen to double down on violence instead of redemption. "Kane's lost his mind," Reynolds snarled, throwing a newspaper onto a makeshift table. The headline read, "Red Devils Leader Supports Veteran Rehabilitation Program." Below it, a photo showed Kane sitting with Michael Anderson at Emma's diner, both men deep in conversation. Back in town, the diner had transformed. Veterans from 3 states filled the tables, sharing coffee and stories with former Red Devils who'd turned in their cuts. The smell of Emma's fresh-baked pie mixed with the sound of men finding their way back to who they used to be. "Never thought I'd see this," James Peterson remarked to Michael, watching Kane help a young former gang member fill out VA paperwork. The man who led them into darkness, now leading them back to the light. Michael's head tilted slightly, tracking movements and conversations by sound alone. Sometimes the best guide is someone who knows both paths intimately. Dr. Chen's office at the VA clinic had become a hub of activity. Phone calls poured in from other towns, other motorcycle clubs, all asking about the Pine Valley model. On her wall hung a newly framed certificate, official recognition from the Department of Veterans Affairs for innovative rehabilitation services. "We've got 18 more veterans in the program," she reported to Rachel Anderson, who was spreading legal documents across the desk. "But Reynolds is making threats. He's telling local businesses anyone who supports us will regret it." Rachel's phone buzzed with updates from her law firm. "Let him threaten. We've got federal protection now. The Justice Department sees this as a pilot program for veteran rehabilitation nationwide." The afternoon brought dark clouds and darker intentions. Reynolds' scouts circled town on their motorcycles, photographing businesses that displayed "We support veteran rehabilitation" signs in their windows. Mrs. Wright stood defiantly in her flower shop doorway as they passed, her window sign prominently displayed. "You sure about this?" Sheriff Matthews asked her, concerned for her safety. "My Harold was a Marine," she replied firmly. "He'd want me standing up for lost warriors finding their way home." Kane rode through town on his motorcycle, no longer leading with intimidation, but with a different kind of strength. Former Red Devils nodded respectfully as he passed, some still struggling with their own transformations, but all recognizing the courage it took to change. At the diner, Michael sat with a group of veterans, his quiet voice carrying wisdom earned through fire and darkness. "The hardest battle isn't against others," he explained to the men who'd recently turned in their cuts. "It's against the darkness, within ourselves, the part that wants to stay lost because being found means facing what we've done." The first strike came at sunset. 3 of Reynolds' men attacked a former Red Devil outside the grocery store, but this time was different. Instead of running, the community rallied. Store owners called Sheriff Matthews. Veterans appeared from nowhere. The attackers found themselves surrounded not by fear, but by united strength. "This isn't your town anymore," one of Reynolds' men shouted as they retreated. "You're right," Kane stepped out of the gathering crowd. "It's not about owning territory now, it's about protecting community." Dr. Chen worked late into the evening handling the aftermath. 4 more called after hearing about the attack. She told Michael, "Reynolds' violence isn't scaring people away, it's showing them why they need to change." Emma's Diner remained open past closing time, becoming a sanctuary for those seeking change. The coffee pot stayed full as former enemies became allies, as lost warriors found their way home, one conversation at a time. "Tell us about Mosul," a recently turned-in Red Devil asked Michael. "We've heard stories, but..." Michael's voice carried clearly in the quiet diner. "Mosul taught me that real strength isn't in destroying enemies, but in saving them. Sometimes the people who seem most lost are the ones most ready to be found." Outside, Reynolds' scouts photographed license plates, tracked movements, gathered intelligence. But for every act of intimidation, the town's resolve grew stronger. Local businesses doubled down on their support. More veterans arrived to help the transformation that had started with one blind veteran, now moved with unstoppable momentum. "He's gathering forces," James Peterson reported, joining Michael and Kane at their regular table. "Reynolds has called in favors from other hardline gangs. They're talking about making an example of Pine Valley." Kane's face showed the weight of his responsibility. "I led them into darkness. Now I have to help lead them out, even if they fight against their own salvation." Rachel arrived with fresh legal documents, her expression serious. "Reynolds' men attacked another former member in Clinton County, but this time we've got footage, witnesses, federal charges ready to file." "Don't," Michael said quietly. "Not yet. Sometimes the door to redemption needs to stay open even for those who seem furthest from wanting it." The night deepened over Pine Valley, but lights burned in Emma's Diner, where the work of transformation continued. Former Red Devils shared midnight coffee with the veterans who understood their struggles. Dr. Chen counseled late into the night. The community stood guard in its own quiet ways. "You knew this would happen," Kane said to Michael as the diner finally emptied. "You knew Reynolds would split off, try to destroy what we're building." "The darkness always fights hardest when the light begins to shine," Michael replied. "But light has a power darkness can never understand, the power to transform rather than destroy." Through the windows, they could see Reynolds' men watching, their motorcycles idling in the distant shadows. But the sight no longer carried fear. Pine Valley had found something stronger than intimidation, the power of community, of redemption, of warriors remembering their true purpose. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. Reynolds' rage would continue to grow, desperate to prove that violence was the only way. But in Emma's Diner, in the VA clinic, in the hearts of transformed warriors, a different truth was taking root. The real war wasn't for territory or power anymore. It was for the soul of every lost warrior, for the chance to turn enemies into allies, darkness into light. And in that war, Michael Anderson's quiet strength was proving more powerful than any show of force. The pre-dawn darkness shattered with the sound of breaking glass and roaring motorcycles. Reynolds had chosen his moment carefully, coordinating attacks across Pine Valley. 3 reformed Red Devils' homes were hit simultaneously. Windows broken, vehicles vandalized. At Emma's Diner, the front window exploded inward as Reynolds himself hurled a brick through it. But Pine Valley had changed. Before Reynolds' men could finish their assault, lights blazed to life across town. Doors opened and citizens emerged, not in fear, but in unity. Veterans who'd been quietly watching over the community moved with practiced precision, while Sheriff Matthews' deputies responded with unexpected reinforcement from local residents. "You're too late, Marcus." Kane's voice cut through the chaos as he rode up to the diner, followed by a dozen reformed warriors. "The town's not afraid anymore. We're not afraid anymore." Michael Anderson sat calmly at his usual table despite the broken glass, his posture radiating a stillness that made Reynolds' violence seem increasingly desperate. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," he said quietly. "Coffee's still hot if you'd like to talk instead of throw things." Dr. Chen arrived at the scene, medical bag in hand, but today it contained more than just first aid supplies. "Got something you should see," she told Sheriff Matthews, pulling out a file. "Reynolds' military records. He served with Thomas in Afghanistan before Mosul. He's not just acting out, he's running from his own past." Inside the diner, Emma calmly swept up broken glass while Lisa served coffee to the growing crowd. The attack had backfired, bringing the community together instead of tearing it apart. Mrs. Wright arrived with fresh flowers, deliberately placing them in the broken window's frame. "My shop's next," she said firmly, "and I'll be waiting with fresh roses and a veteran support poster twice as big as the last one." Rachel Anderson worked her phone with fierce intensity, coordinating with state police and federal authorities. "Reynolds just made a tactical error," she told James Peterson. "His attacks crossed state lines. We've got FBI involvement now if we want it." But Michael raised his hand, stopping her mid-dial. "Sometimes the hardest men to save are the ones most desperate to prove they don't need saving." Reynolds' men regrouped at the edge of town, their numbers notably smaller than before the attack. Some had seen the community's response and begun questioning their path. Others remembered their own service, their own lost way, their own need for redemption. "This isn't what we signed up for," one of them muttered, looking back at the town. "Breaking windows, attacking homes. We're supposed to be warriors, not thugs." Kane rode out to meet them alone and unarmed. His cut now bore a new patch, one that spoke of rehabilitation and redemption rather than violence and fear. "I know why you're angry," he called to his former brothers. "Change is hard, redemption is harder, but look around you. Look what we're becoming." Through the broken diner window, more transformed warriors arrived to help with cleanup. Veterans worked alongside former enemies, sharing stories, showing paths forward. Dr. Chen set up an impromptu counseling station in one corner, while Rachel helped process paperwork for those ready to enter the program. "He's losing them," James Peterson observed, watching more of Reynolds' followers hesitate, looking between their leader's rage and the scene of community before them. Every act of violence pushes more toward transformation. Reynolds saw it, too, his face contorted with fury as 3 more riders removed their cuts, laying them down before walking toward the diner. "Traitors!" he screamed. "You're all traitors!" "No." Michael's voice carried clearly from his corner table. "They're loyal to something deeper, the warriors they were meant to be, the protectors they can become again." The morning sun rose over Pine Valley, illuminating the damage from Reynolds' attack. But instead of fear and division, it revealed something unexpected. The town had come alive with activity, people cleaning, repairing, supporting each other. Every act of destruction met with twice as much restoration. "Got another group coming in," Dr. Chen announced, watching a truck arrive with lumber to repair the diner's window. "Former Marines who heard about the program. They're offering to help protect reformed members while they go through rehabilitation." Rachel discovered something in Reynolds' military files that changed everything. "Dad," she said quietly to Michael, "he was there that night in Mosul, not with Kane's unit. He was part of the support team that was supposed to go back for survivors. He froze, never went in." Michael nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. Shame is a powerful enemy. Sometimes men do terrible things trying to bury it. The day progressed with tension building. Reynolds' remaining followers grew increasingly agitated as more brothers chose transformation over loyalty to their leader. Each hour brought new defections, new signs of the old order crumbling. "He's planning something bigger," Kane warned during an emergency meeting at the diner. "Marcus never could accept losing. He'll try to destroy everything we're building, even if it means destroying himself." Emma served coffee to the planning session, her voice firm. "Let him try. This isn't just your fight anymore. It's all of ours. Every person in this town who believes in second chances, every veteran who remembers their own journey home." Through it all, Michael sat at his corner table, a steady presence as plans were made and strategies discussed. His phone rang constantly, more veterans arriving, more resources offering support, more lost warriors seeking guidance. "You knew it would come to this," James Peterson said, joining him late in the day. "The darkness making its last stand against the light." "The hardest battle," Michael replied, "is the one against our own shadows. Reynolds isn't just fighting us, he's fighting the warrior he used to be, the man he's afraid to remember." As night fell over Pine Valley, Reynolds' remaining forces gathered at their makeshift base. But now, barely 15 riders remained, where once there had been over 40. The others had chosen a different path, finding their way back to honor one difficult step at a time. "Tomorrow," Reynolds promised his dwindling followers, "we show them what happens to traitors. Tomorrow we remind them why the Red Devils are feared." But in Emma's diner, now repaired and more crowded than ever, a different kind of strength was gathering. Reformed warriors sat with veterans, planning not for violence, but for protection. The community stood ready, united not in fear, but in determination to defend their transformation. The final battle for Pine Valley's soul was coming, but it wouldn't be fought with fists or weapons. It would be won or lost in the hearts of men choosing between darkness and light, between violence and redemption, between staying lost and finding their way home. The autumn dawn painted Pine Valley's main street in shades of gold as the remains of Reynolds' gang prepared for their final stand. Under cover of darkness, they'd positioned men around key points in town, each one hand-picked. For their hardened resistance to change, Reynolds himself paced in the abandoned warehouse, checking weapons, his face twisted with a rage that had long since moved beyond reason. "We end this today," he growled to his remaining loyalists. "No more talking, no more redemption. We show them what happens when you betray the Red Devils." But Pine Valley was ready. Through the night, veterans and transformed warriors had quietly taken up positions throughout town, not with weapons or threats, but with the steady resolve of men who'd found their way back to honor and wouldn't let it be taken again. At Emma's diner, Michael Anderson sat at his usual corner table, listening to the pre-dawn preparations. Kane stood by the window, his posture reflecting his military training rather than his years as a gang leader. "He's got men at the lumber mill, the old factory, and along River Street," Kane reported. "Classic military-style deployment. He remembers his training, even if he's forgotten everything else. Sometimes, what we try hardest to forget is what we need most to remember," Michael replied, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Dr. Chen arrived early, carrying not just her medical bag, but a thick file. "Found something in the Mosul. Records," she told Michael quietly. "Reynolds was decorated before that night, Silver Star for valor. He wasn't always what he's become." Rachel Anderson worked her phone, coordinating with law enforcement. "State police are standing by," she reported. "But Dad's right. This has to end another way. Violence will only prove Reynolds' point." The first move came at sunrise. Reynolds' men attempted to block the town's main entrances, but found themselves facing not resistance, but invitation. Every roadblock was met by veterans offering coffee, by reformed warriors extending hands of welcome, by community members showing the strength of unity. "This isn't how it's supposed to work," one of Reynolds' men shouted in frustration. "Where's the fear? Where's the respect?" "Real respect," Kane's voice carried across the morning air, "doesn't come from fear. It comes from honor. Remember who you were before you forgot." Through the morning, more of Reynolds' men faced this unusual response to their aggression. Each act of intimidation met with calm offers of help, each threat countered with understanding. The psychological impact was devastating to men who only understood the language of violence. "He's losing them," James Peterson observed, watching another Red Devil remove his cut. "They can't fight against this kind of strength." Inside the diner, transformed warriors shared their stories with those still wavering. "I was where you..." Thompson told a young rider who'd slipped away from Reynolds' group. "Thought strength meant making others afraid. Now I know real strength is helping others find their way back." Reynolds' response was swift and desperate. He led a charge down Main Street, motorcycles roaring, but found his path blocked not by barricades, but by lines of veterans and community members standing together. In the front row stood Mrs. Wright, holding fresh flowers. "These are for you. Marcus," she called out using his real name, "when you're ready to remember who you were." The gesture hit harder than any weapon. Reynolds' bike wavered, nearly going down. Behind him, more of his men pulled up short, the contrast between violence and compassion becoming too stark to ignore. Dr. Chen stepped forward, medical bag in hand. "We found your service records, Marcus. The man you were before Mosul, he's still in there, still worthy of the medals he earned." "Shut up," Reynolds screamed, but his voice cracked. "You don't know anything." "I know about the night you froze," Michael's voice carried clearly from the diner doorway. "About the weight you've carried since then, the shame you've tried to bury under anger." The street fell silent. Reynolds' hands trembled on his motorcycle's handlebars. "I couldn't go back in," he whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. "They were screaming for help, and I couldn't." "No one can be strong all the time," Michael replied gently. "The true measure of a warrior isn't never failing. It's what we do after we fail, how we find our way back." Kane stepped forward, his cut now bearing both his old Red Devil's patch and his new rehabilitation program insignia. "We've all carried shame, brother. All tried to drown the memories in violence, but there's another way." One by one, Reynolds' remaining men began to move, not forward in attack, but sideways, cutting their engines, some removing their cuts. The wall of rage he'd built began to crumble. "What am I supposed to do?" Reynolds' voice had lost its hardness, revealing the lost warrior beneath. "After everything I've done." "The same thing we all did," Kane replied. "Take the first step. Let people help. Remember the man you were meant to be." Emma emerged from the diner carrying coffee. Her simple act of walking calmly through the tension spoke volumes about the power of compassion over fear. "Your usual seat's open, Marcus," she said quietly, "whenever you're ready." The morning sun broke fully through the clouds, illuminating. A scene no one could have predicted weeks ago. Reynolds looked around at his dwindling force, at the united community before him, at the transformed warriors who'd found their way back to honor. Slowly, his hands shaking, he reached up to his cut. The sound of the zipper seemed to echo in the morning quiet. When the leather hit the ground, others followed, like autumn leaves finally letting go. "I don't know how to come back," he admitted, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Nobody does at first," Michael replied. "That's why we help each other find the way." The war for Pine Valley's soul ended not with a battle, but with a homecoming. One by one, lost warriors found their way, back to who they were meant to be. The transformation that had started with a confrontation in Emma's diner had come full circle, proving that even the hardest heart could find its way back to the light. Dr. Chen opened her medical bag, now filled with program documents and paths to healing. Rachel Anderson pulled out the paperwork for a fresh start. James Peterson's veterans moved forward not to fight, but to welcome brothers back to the fold. The morning that had begun with the threat of violence ended with the promise of redemption. Pine Valley had shown that true strength lay not in the power to destroy, but in the courage to heal. 1 year to the day since the Red Devils first rode into Pine Valley, Michael Anderson sat at his usual corner table in Emma's diner, listening to the sounds of complete transformation. The morning bustle carried none of the tension it once had. Instead, the air filled with purpose and hope as transformed warriors went about their new missions of helping others heal. Kane, now fully certified as a rehabilitation counselor, organized the day's anniversary celebrations. His own transformation had become legendary. The former gang leader now led international training sessions for rehabilitation programs worldwide. Final numbers came in from the East Coast, he told Michael, setting down fresh coffee. Every major outlaw motorcycle club has either entered rehabilitation or disbanded. The old way of life is over. Warriors are choosing to remember who they were meant to be. Dr. Chen arrived with groundbreaking news. The Pine Valley model had been adopted as the national standard for veteran rehabilitation. Her research had revolutionized how America approached veteran healing, proving that transformation was possible for even the hardest cases. The psychiatric community finally understands, she explained, spreading her latest data across the table. Clinical treatment alone isn't enough. Warriors need warriors to guide them home. Through the diner windows, Pine Valley showed its complete transformation. The town had become a national center for warrior rehabilitation, its streets patrolled by men who had once terrorized them. Each transformed warrior wore their new purpose with quiet pride. Your father did something unprecedented, Rachel told. A gathering of journalists. He didn't just create a program, he sparked a movement that's changing how the nation helps warriors heal. Emma moved through her busy diner, now famous as the birthplace of modern warrior rehabilitation. Her simple approach to creating safe spaces had been replicated nationwide, but the original diner remained special. A place where the hardest transformations first became possible. Reynolds, now 1 year into his own journey of redemption, worked with new program participants, his hard-earned wisdom helping others face their own demons. His presence alone proved the program's power. The man who had fought hardest against change now led others toward it. The hardest step isn't turning in your colors, he told a group of newcomers. It's facing the warrior you used to be, the one who knew the difference between protecting and destroying. As evening approached, Pine Valley prepared for its anniversary celebration. The community center filled with transformed warriors and their families, each story of redemption adding to the program's legacy. Look around, Rachel told observers. Every man here was once considered lost beyond hope. Now they're the strongest force for positive change in their communities. Michael listened to the success stories flowing in from across the nation, each transformed life adding another thread to the tapestry of healing being woven across the country. The war for warrior souls had been won not through force, but through something more powerful. The reminder that inside every lost warrior was a protector waiting to be remembered. Tomorrow brings new challenges, he told Kane. More warriors needing to find their way home, but now we know the path. Now we can light the way for others. Up next, you've got 2 more incredible stories waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot to us.